Hello and welcome to this masterclass. My name is Morag Gamble. The topic for this session is all about no-dig gardening. So we're going to focus on the 5 key tips that I have to help you make and maintain a no-dig garden. Before I begin though, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm meeting with you today, the Gubbi Gubbi people, and to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And if you know the traditional lands on which you're seated today, then I encourage you to add that into the chat. Also, I'd like to welcome everyone here who's part of the Permaculture Educators program of the Permaculture Education Institute, and welcome all of you who are joining from around the world. It's wonderful to see so many people joining in on this conversation. Now, what I'd like you to suggest that you do is, if you have some questions or discussion or ideas, to pop them in the chat. So if you're watching this live, you'll see the chat box and you can dive in there and do that. If you're seeing this as a recording, then please pop your questions down below and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. So this is part of a series of monthly online classes that I've been doing now for a couple of years. So we've explored a whole lot of different topics, from ethics to looking at COVID to the SDGs to bushfires, and you can find many of these on my YouTube channel, and I'll give you links to all of those later. But if you do want to sign up for future notification of these masterclasses, then please go to the website and you'll see Masterclass, and that's a spot to go and sign in for that. So no-dig, look, what is this all about? Well, there's so many different ways of describing what a no-dig garden is. Often I think we might have just sort of a one idea of it being a vegetable garden no-dig, but we can also explore the concept of no-dig from it being a forage garden, a food forest, even a syntropic way of growing, or analog forestry, and even wild harvesting. So there's lots of different ways, and actually it's a particularly natural way of gardening, this whole concept of no-dig. So I'm going to explore firstly sort of some of the different approaches that there are, why no-dig, and then dive into some of the key strategies that I've found to help make it work. So you'll see it described as no-dig, no-till. Sometimes you might even see things like lasagna method or sheet mulching. They're all different versions of it. But essentially the idea is about least disturbance as possible and adding material on top that will get incorporated in. So you might have come across people like Ruth Stout, an American woman who advocated for just adding mulch on top and then leaving that and allowing the soil to draw it in and planting directly into that. In Australia, you might have heard of Esther Dean, whose gardening book, Growing Without Digging, was very popular in the 70s and actually one of the inspirations behind permaculture gardening as well. And then since the 80s, this gentleman here, Charles Dowding, has been advocating for no-dig gardening in the UK. So this is Charles and Steph Hafferty, and both of them have written a lot about no-dig gardening. You'll see some books they've written together. And this one here, No-Dig Year-Round Harvest, is written by Steph herself. And this is an aerial view of Charles's home farm, which is a no-dig market garden. And you'll see he has a YouTube, and you'll see enormous amounts of information there too about all his different approaches to no-dig gardening. His is slightly different from mine, but essentially it's the same underlying principles. So I think, find the method that works the best for you. What I'm going to be doing here is trying to share what, the best that I've learned as I've traveled around the world looking at different methods. Another man is Hugh Richards. Now, Hugh is just in his early 20s now, and he's been doing a YouTube channel too since he's about 12, and has released a couple of books already and has some online courses about his method of no-dig gardening. He's based in Wales. And I've also spent a lot of time too with people like Wurunga, who I've walked through the forest with him. He's talked about how, Indigenous ways of growing, it was a lot around no-dig, just about, allowing things to self-seed, focusing on perennials and and the foods that were naturally there, and just, with a digging stick, not digging up the soil, but just making a hole and putting things in. And so, no dig has so many different ways of manifesting. Also, you can take it to the broader scale, from no-till farming. Dr. Charles Massey talks a lot about this, and you might have read his book, Call of the Reed Warbler. And, he talks about health coming from the ground up. So also in Sweden, Richard Perkins talks a lot about no-dig market gardening, and from a perspective of regenerative agriculture. This is his book, which is an amazing book. You might like to have a look at that, or also his YouTube channel. So, as I said, I've been experimenting with no-dig garden for almost 30 years now in all different contexts. And I've found, locally adapting the strategies just is a fantastic way. It works in all different contexts that I've been in. If you want to have a look at the system that I've been evolving and has been the basis of how I created my garden here, you can see my YouTube channel as well has a film there about how to make a no-dig garden. So I encourage you to dive in and have a look at that. But my life is essentially wrapped in a no-dig garden. My house is surrounded by gardens that are evolving and changing in this dynamic relationship with me and the seasons and what decides to come up at different times as well. And it's just an absolutely beautiful way to be, that, the garden informs my life, and what comes out of my home feeds into the garden. And it's a wonderful relationship. I plant when there's a gap. I rarely weed, actually, or even water necessarily. And I harvest something for every meal. And it's not about a lazy garden. It's not about being a lazy gardener. It's actually just working with nature. So it is a natural gardening approach. It is about feeding the soil. So focusing on feeding the soil as opposed to focusing on feeding the plant. It's about building organic matter, because organic matter is what becomes a sponge for the moisture, and it's what helps to feed all the soil life, which then feed the plants and keeps the soil structure improving over time. It's about top dressing, continuously top dressing, and it's enormously ideal for home gardeners. And as you've seen, as I mentioned before, too, the approach can be expanded up to any different scale. So I see no-dig gardening as a way of essentially working with nature. And it's the local nature, what's happening in your bioregion, that informs how you design your particular no-dig garden. So why is it damaging, though, to dig? Well, this picture at the top is actually what happened in my city. This is Melbourne in the mid-1980s. And I remember being in the midst of that. I remember these clouds of dust rolling over us, and we had no idea what was going on at the time. And this kind of launched the land care movement. It launched a great focus on soil and what's happening in our agricultural system, and how the chemicals, exposure to elements, compaction and lack of organic matter is destroying topsoil. In fact, a third of global topsoil has been lost in 40 years. And that basically means we're consuming about almost 3.5 tons of topsoil per person per year globally. And we're losing 30 soccer fields, if you need a different visual, a minute of topsoil. And essentially in this system of farming, we're losing 10 times faster than it's able to replenish. But what no-dig gardening does is it actually helps us to build soil rapidly. So even if we start with something like what we see in the bottom there, we can rapidly turn that around through these methods, which are working with the natural processes that we find in our place. And essentially what it means is we just get more time being in the garden, more time relaxing there, enjoying, noticing, observing, harvesting, foraging, and, just really being part of the garden. What I love about this type of gardening too is that it helps to retain the moisture. So as I said before, I don't water very much at all, only when it really needs it or there's something just starting. But essentially by building up the organic matter and constantly feeding and top dressing, what it means is that the soil is acting like a sponge. And also the way that I shape the land before I begin the no-dig gardens, which means either from terracing or a little bit of a swale before it or soaks for pathways. It means that the water that does come gets soaked into the ground and then the organic matter holds it like it. And this makes such a difference. Also, I find that there's fewer weeds. So, when I'm top dressing, after I've started the first no-dig garden, I'll talk in a minute about how I use a weed barrier to get started. But once I've got going, actually I find that there's few weeds that I need to worry about. And it gets better each year. Another thing about no-dig gardening too is that it essentially is about building soil life. It is helping to bring back the soil ecology. And any of you have seen any of Elaine Ingham's work about the key part of creating a healthy food system is about focusing on the soil. And you might see there in the middle there, Elaine's note to farmers: don't till because you'll hurt the microbes. So what is a live soil? Well, in just a tablespoon, there's billions of living things. And, these can be single and multi-cell microorganisms, worms, insects, spiders, beetles. And in fact, in 1 tablespoon, you'll find kilometres of fungal filaments. That's those fine threads, the hyphae, the mycelial network, which is reaching through, connecting the plants, and going deep into the soil, into the cells of the soil, and bringing out the nutrients and moisture, which is in relationship with the plants, feeding the plants, and at the same time feeding the mycelial network, which helps to feed the soil ecology. And this is the foraging web of life. So as you can imagine, if you start to dig the soil, what happens is you start to chop these mycelial threads, these hyphae. And so that then has to start again to recreate itself. And if it's exposed, these die out as well because they get too hot or too dry. So keeping the soil protected and moist and unchopped gives this the ability to spread and to actually create a vibrant and healthy soil. Another thing that's really important to take into consideration too is that humus, which is that broken down organic matter, is actually 60% carbon. So the more that we feed our soil and improve our soil, we're actually drawing down carbon. So it's climate action too. So the first thing we need to focus on is making topsoil. But before you begin this, I really want to encourage you to spend the time observing and designing. So before you start to make your garden, look at where is your garden in relation to your home and to your kitchen and to the access points. What's going on in the soil already? What are the sorts of things that you need to do to help bring it alive? Where is the sun coming from so that you make sure that you get enough sun for your garden to grow? 6 hours is a good standard amount. If it's just leafy greens, you can get away with a bit less. If you're in a cooler climate, you might need a little bit more, particularly for the fruiting ones. Make sure you garden somewhere where it's not getting battered by wind, and think about what kind of access you have for water and how you might design your site to be able to draw down the water that is falling on your site or going through your site so that it's soaked into your soil. So spend that time first observing, designing. This is kind of like the permaculture approach, not just thinking, I want a garden and just race straight to doing the bed. Think about where it is, how it fits, how it's creating cycles in your garden system and going to be the best possible fit and drawing on all the resources that you have available. So what are those resources that you need? Well, firstly, you need to think about where you're going to get organic matter. This is probably one of the most important things you need to start focusing on. So have a look around your environment. What kind of trees do you have? What kind of shrubs? Maybe there's some grasses or weeds that you can chop and gather. Maybe there's compost material from your kitchen. Possibly think about cafes or fruit and veg stores. Where can you access materials? Join up one of those share waste clubs where you can collect resources from other people. Taking that and making it into your own compost. So whether that be a compost bin or a compost bay or a tumbler or a bokashi bin, something like that. To find a way to actually get as much organic matter and to turn as much of it into compost. So maybe you might need to wait before you start your no-dig garden until you've got these things together, because without these, it's really not going to work. So just take a bit of have a bit of patience first to make sure that you get these things right. You'll also need, I think, particularly in the early days, if you're just starting out on an area, some kind of weed barrier. But as I mentioned before, you get to a point where the system has evolved that you actually probably don't need it as you're replenishing later on. And mulch. So I'll talk a little bit about each of these things as we go on. So your first step is gathering these resources. So the essential approach that I use is thinking about building this up in layers. So starting with number one, what I do is I actually water the area first, so that make sure that it's really nice and moist, so that as you add these layers, you're keeping the moisture in. Because if you add all these layers and put all the mulch on, it might be dry underneath, and then you don't get the activation happening. So make sure it's wet. If it's just rained, it's probably the best time to do it because it's nice and moist. If there's any weeds on there, I just sort of snip them back and lay them on top. Leave all the roots in the ground, because as they die back, they'll actually add organic matter into the soil, which is what you want. So don't go pulling everything out and tossing it to the side. I'm more of the thing of finding what's around and tossing it in there, gathering bits and pieces around. If it's got some seeds in it, it doesn't matter, because we are going to put the weed barrier on top. It will help prevent the seeds. Across to number two, if it's really compacted, I do sometimes just stick a fork in just to wedge it a bit. People like Charles Dowling say, don't bother with that, doesn't matter how clayey it is. I've tried all different methods, and I see that they all work. Sometimes if I just feel like I want to kickstart it a little bit more and open it up a bit more, I do this. So it's up to you. Do a couple of experiments and see what you think. Play with this. So once if I've done the opening, then I'll feed the soil as well. So I might be adding things like liquid fertilizers or worm castings. Maybe, any manures that I find, maybe it could be my guinea pig food, or it could be cow manure, aged horse manure, chicken manure, maybe even just some food scraps that you've got around, or comfrey leaves. What is it that you can find around that you can put in that's going to be really beautifully rich soil food? And then also add that layer of compost. So I typically add at least 10 centimetres of compost on top. Now, sometimes this is mixed with a bit of maybe some leafy greens compost, comfrey as well, things like that. But whatever you can do, try and get a nice thick layer. Don't just sort of scatter it across. This is the really important layer. And then I also just water that layer as well. Just make sure that that's nice and moist and all the bits are connecting to one another. So the manures and the leaves and the compost are all sort of connected by this moist layer. And then it's on top of that I put the weed barrier. Now this might be where you think, oh, hang on a tick, didn't I see in another no-dig garden method that you put newspaper on the bottom? Well, this is where I like to flip the concept, because what I find is that if you put newspaper down first and then the compost on top, what you're doing is actually separating the soil food from the soil. Focusing on the newspaper for weed barrier on the soil, but separating everything. And what happens is then the sun then also dries the compost more. So flip it. I talk about this more in the film too, so have a look at that if you want more information. So the newspaper goes over the top, overlapping about 10 centimetres, and nice and thick, it's about 10 sheets thick, and it goes over the edge, down across the path, because the path will get the weed seeds coming as well. The other thing about this too, with the weed barrier on the top of the compost, unless you're a master composter, there is going to be weeds, there's going to be seeds in your compost. So it's a way of actually helping just to get that all managed. And then on top of that, a very thick layer of mulch, as thickly as you can, and then water that down so it's all connected. Now, if your compost is if your compost layer is mostly compost, you can plant into it straight away. I tend to just pull back a little bird's nest, poke a hole through the paper where I want to plant the transplant, and then put a little handful of compost and put it in there. The layer of the newspaper is what I imagine to be the new layer of topsoil. And then this will take off absolutely beautifully. And over the top of the path, you can see I also cover the newspaper. You can put anything there, leaves, sawdust, other bits of mulching material, whether it be harder mulch. And this composts over time, and then I scoop that up for next season and put it onto the top. So this is the kind of the basic layering system that I use, and what has been used to start all of my gardens here. So, think about what your abundances are, because this is what you want to be able to put into that layer of compost and bulk up that compost well. So maybe it's things like mulberry leaves. What other leaves do you have around you? I wouldn't be using so many things like eucalyptus leaves or pine needles, but there's many leaves from your garden that are really usable, particularly things like acacia leaves, or anything that's of the legume family is also really good. I actually grow plants, particularly with my soil in mind. So I grow comfrey because I want to be able to make it into compost. I want to be able to harvest it to put it into my no-dig gardens. And I know that its roots are deep and drawing up nutrients from deep down and helping to break up the soil as well. I can also make a liquid fertilizer from the comfrey leaves, which is almost as potent as chicken manure tea. And so think about that. It's not just about just the compost or bringing in materials from outside. What is it that you can be growing? So whether it be things that will add nutrients into your garden or growing mulch materials too. Pioneer legumes are also fantastic for this. So things like pigeon peas. This is pigeon pea, and I often grow this around the garden, and then it's easy to kind of strip some leaves off this or do a chop and drop, and they go into a no-dig garden as well. Or, in some areas even, I grow lots of living mulch. So over the top of a mulched area, I might then grow other things. And then next season, it will just kind of become part of the new mulch layer. So things like sweet potatoes, or even where there's pumpkins growing and other things, I allow it to be that extra layer of mulch on top of an already mulched area. And so this concept of adding materials all the time. So when the sweet potatoes are finished, I don't rip them off and take them away somewhere else to compost them. I leave them in situ and then compost on top of that. And so this idea of in situ composting, I think, is absolutely fantastic. And that can be what I've just mentioned with just this layering of plants in the garden, or finding a spot in your garden where you think, it's not looking so great, and actually taking the compost bin to that place. So I have these little bins like this that I move around in my garden, and I'll do a bit of composting there. And then when it looks like it's ready, I'll just lift off the bin, spread out the compost, then do the mulch on top of that. And then I'll move the bin to another spot. And so this bin just keeps rotating around the garden to different spots. You can also see some of my worm towers in behind that. So that's just a way of having compost going directly into the garden and feeding compost worms in those towers, and then being sort of like a point of activation where lots of things, lots of soil life comes in and extracts the nutrients and distributes it around those areas of the garden. And then there's also worm casting. So we have a number of these different worm farms around the place, which many of our food scraps go into, or even things from the garden. Fruits that don't look so great to eat will go into there. And then the materials from this is also part of what we do. So we take the castings out of the top and make a tea from that and water that onto that mixture that we're making, to really help to activate it, or even use it to help make the compost, which is what we plant the seedlings into the garden with. So having worm farms as well as compost, all of these things are beneficial. So don't just focus on having one form of compost. Try and think about having multiple forms. So it's things that are growing in your garden to feed it. There may be liquid fertilizers. There's worm farms. There's worm towers, compost bins. Find as many ways that you can be gathering organic matter and putting it back into your soil. So organic matter, all of this way of collecting your abundance and making compost, this is the key to having good soil life. This is the food for soil life, and it's the sponge for the water. So this is what we're trying to create. And by adding lots of organic matter and top dressing, you can very rapidly create this. This is your garden gold. And you can, also gather weeds, or so-called weeds, from around the area. I've got a tree growing around me called Paulownia, which has massive great leaves on it. But they compost very rapidly. They're soft leaves. So I gather them and just add them into my layers, but also add them into compost, or I can shred them and make compost very rapidly. Or there's things like purslanes or chickweeds or, even cobbler's pegs before they've seeded. I'll grab all of those and put them into my garden. So a weed barrier, what is this weed barrier? Well, on top of the compost materials that you've put inside, my standard that I always have used for a long time is newspaper as a way to get it started. So I'll gather newspapers from friends and neighbours and the community and the local newsagent. I haven't really read a newspaper physically for a long time, and I'm actually finding it challenging to get newspaper now, which is kind of good because now I don't need so much because it's kind of almost weed free in most of the areas that I'm working on now. But in order to get a new garden started, I always keep a stockpile to help me to do this. So basically underneath this is all those different layers that I talked about. Them either might be manures or compost and leafy greens, and then I layer the newspaper on top like this. And newspaper, I find, is probably one of the easiest things to use in the vegetable garden. If you use cardboard, often it's really hard to actually poke a hole through. Because I use the weed barrier on the top as opposed to underneath, you do actually need to poke a hole through it. So if it's cardboard, it can be quite a challenge. So I still think that newspaper is one of the easiest things that you can use for this purpose. So, some people ask me about the soy-based inks. I do have a post on my blog about this, so if you want to find out more about that, go and have a read there. I've done some research and you can look into that and why I still actually do use newspaper and recommend using newspaper in this format. So some tips for using paper. Well, what I do is when I leave the perennials, I actually wrap around them. So I don't go too much up the trunk, but I don't try and clear the whole area. I'll actually go around perennials that are already there, leave them in the ground, start with the beds first, and then do, as I walk my way out of the little pathways, you can see there's gaps in that first picture there. I then walk my way back out of the pathway and paper that as I go. I always try and overlap. I don't know if you can see in this middle picture how it's overlap. It's on a slight slope. So it's the reverse of a roof. When a tin roof, for example, you want to make sure that the bottom layer is on first and then the top layer rushes water over the top. We're wanting to do this the other way around. So you actually, if the water's running down this, it gets caught underneath that layer and goes in. So the overlapping, so you start with the top and then you overlap the next one down. And that way you can actually harvest some water. The other thing is, as you are planting into this, you make divots. And so it collects water into the spot. Some people ask, well, isn't this just going to shed water? The way that you do it can actually help to gather the water. So then on top of the newspaper, what we do is we add thick layer of mulch. Now this thick layer of mulch, basically I added enough so that you can't see the paper, and then I add a bit more. Very scientific, I know. But basically once it's covered the paper, over time it's going to settle down and break down, and then you'll start to see the paper. You never want to see the paper. One, it's kind of an ugly thing to see in the garden. But two, if you see the paper, it's going to break down more rapidly and blow away and crack and actually start to distort a bit and making air gaps in the garden. So you want to keep the paper nice and moist. And I always moisten the paper first because it actually means that you're not sucking moisture out of the ground. You've spent that time getting it nice and moist. So put it down like that. It also helps stopping it blowing away if you've got a bit of a gust. So the type of mulch, well, anything that's seed-free essentially, and that is going to break down nicely. So I get a grass hay from a local farmer that's relatively seed-free. I've not really ever had many problems with that. If you're in an urban area, probably something more like a sugarcane mulch is what you can find. But you can grow your own. If you've got something like a lemongrass or even cannas, you can chop it up nice and finely. Or leaf mold, leaf matter, you can use that. I just don't use things like the really hard woody material in and around a vegetable garden because I find it either becomes a little bit too acidic or it's too heavy in terms of drawing nitrogen out of the soil to break it down. This material, the light, fluffy, seed-free hay or whatever you can find, whatever you call that in your area, because I know different places have different names for this, I find it's easier to mould around plants. It's easy to pull back and make little nests that you can plant your seedlings into, and it quite rapidly becomes part of the soil. And I just find this is such a helpful material. So this is something I do import from a local farmer into my garden, and I then, as I said, have living mulch that goes with that, which I mix with this. So I'm trying as much as I can to gather materials for my own garden, but then find other things from around the region and help me to really get this garden going. So my garden began as just a 1 in 5 slope, and I ended up at the bottom of my garden. You can see where Evan is standing there. Above him you can see lemongrasses and cannas, and these were all ways of helping to slow down the moisture to grow organic matter. So when we were first getting started, it was just getting organic matter happening. And then to create a flat spot where we can, the kids can play and where we can run permaculture workshops, we pushed back with this wall to create some terraces. And this has been a really important part of being at the bottom of our garden, which can then hold back any of the last bits of moisture and nutrients, create this really rich place to collect organic matter and make our most vibrant gardens. And this is it, just maybe a year or two later after the wall was put in. What I do find in these gardens, though, it's really important when you're getting started, is often just to use transplants, or seedlings. You can use big seeds if you like, but I find to get them started when you're just beginning is to have your own seedlings. So think about too where you might be able to set up a little shaded nursery spot and you can get your own seeds happening. It's much more cheaper and effective to do that. And you also have far better control over the types of seeds that you can choose as well. So you can get your own local community seed bank seeds or ones from a local organic non-hybrid supplier. And this is important because what this does is if you start with plants like this, the ones that you know are suited to your particular bioregion, and then you save seeds from those, you'll actually be building the strength and resilience into your garden. And also by thinking about, okay, I'm designing and planting this garden so that I can be saving seeds. That too is a really important part, because if we just constantly relying on bringing in seeds each season or bringing in seedlings each season, we've missed a huge part of the possibilities of making our plants more locally adapted and stronger. Because what we do is we select the seeds from the healthiest looking plant, the least pest-prone plant, the one that has the nicest fruit or the yummiest leaves that we like, the best flavour, and we harvest from those. We harvest the seeds from them. And so you become engaged in that process of building up your seed store and your seed resilience. So as the second key part of, that was sort of part of making the soil and making the garden and getting to the point of where we are now in this conversation, thinking about what you eat and what you expect to grow is a big part of having success in your garden, particularly in this form of gardening. What you want to be doing is making it easy, being able to grow an abundance of different sorts of food, but pick the hardy things, and particularly when you're getting started, as your soil is evolving into something that's really rich. What are the things that will grow with absolute ease? So, the simple cherry tomatoes or the perennial greens and some perennial chilies and haffy limes and self-seeding pumpkins and all different, the purple flower in there, that's garlic chives, flat leaf parsley. What are the things, the herbs and the vegetables and the fruits that you can grow that are really low maintenance in your area? Begin there, because some of the things that you might want to grow may need the soil to be a little bit more alive or a little bit more vibrant or a little bit more deep before you're going to get things thriving. So start with the simple, hardy things. And once I started with that, I actually realized how easy it was to garden, that I haven't ever really reintroduced any of the things that you have to fuss about, because you just get so much food from those. So be responsive. Let the resilience of your garden, let the things which just come and be strong inform your choices. And then also allow your climate and your seasons to inform your garden too. And then this becomes, so your seasons, the resilience of your plants and your climate over time, then determine what are the types of things that you grow, and your diet is responsive to that. Rather than trying to say, okay, well, I want to grow this, this, and this, and then try and make it happen, notice what works really well and adapt your diet to fit with your region. Some of the things which I find grow really well in my area are a lot of the things from various different sorts of subtropical cultures, which are not so familiar here in Australia, for example. This is a ginseng leaf or sambang spinach, longevity spinach, and it grows without me even trying. All I need to do to plant it is take a cutting from that and plug it in somewhere else. It will tumble over the edge of the wall or even grow underneath the fruit trees. So there's the spinach, done. I don't even have to worry about trying to even grow anything else. And in order to harvest, I just pluck off some edges, the nice young juicy bits, and then I'll throw out new ones. All I need to do is to top dress that with some more compost. Again, each season, and it'll just keep growing fine. Things like this just make life as a gardener, as a food gardener, so, so easy. So what is it in your garden that you notice, or in gardens that you've noticed around your region that just grows so healthily and vibrantly? And so the other idea too around this type of gardening is to, rather than thinking about planting and pulling, it's about foraging, plucking a leaf, a little bit here and a little bit there. And then you'll get, a fresh daily selection of different things. So maybe a daily bowl of cherry tomatoes and a daily basket of 20 different leafy greens. And there's always something to eat. But you never quite know what it's going to be necessarily. But whatever you find in your garden, whatever your kids bring in from the garden when you send them out to harvest, is what becomes the basis of what you're growing. And then if you notice that you're starting to think, oh, I'd like a bit more diversity, then you find the gaps and fill your gaps. I often grow from cuttings, a lot of what I do. So I started my garden with seeds and with seedlings, but more over time I'm actually growing plants which I just take a snip and plug. It's like a snip and a plug. If there's a gap, I'll find something in the garden that I'd like to spread a bit further, or a snip from someone else's garden, or wherever it might be, and just plant in that way. And you can even do that with kale. So when a kale gets quite tall and leggy, you'll find it looks like it's just about to, it's getting a bit bug eaten by that point at the top, but you'll see off the side it gets little shoots. So you can just gently snip those off and plant those. So even from a kale, you can do cuttings. You can do cuttings from tomatoes, from basil, from eggplant, from chili. So many different of the plants that we grow can actually be grown from. Another thing that I think is really important to keep in mind too is that most of the parts of the plants of our vegetables are all edible. So why wait for the one bit that you think that you want, like, just the broccoli, or just the leaf of the spinach, or just the onion bulb. You can eat the onion leaves, you can eat the garlic leaves, you can eat the flowers of the mustard spinaches and any brassica, you can eat the leaves of the peas, you can eat the leaves of the broccoli. So what this does is actually gives you the opportunity to compact your garden and to be eating almost from the moment things start. Just a little pluck of a leaf of a new broccoli as a cabbage alternative, and as the peas are starting to go up, you can be snipping off the little young shoots, and that can be a salad alternative. So, it starts to break apart the conception of what we think of as being what is important as the things that we grow. And then once the no-dig garden is starting to really evolve, what you see is things start to self-seed. So as the tomatoes start to drop, as the pumpkins start to drop, as the parsley seeds, the lettuce seeds, the soil becomes your seed bank. It becomes a repository for all this wonderful growth. And so the pumpkins just keep getting better each year. They just are remarkable. I haven't planted a pumpkin for maybe 15 years now, but I always have pumpkins. Allow your garden to self-seed and encourage it to be dropping seeds. But the thing is that, though, with the self-seeding is to notice which ones that you do want to seed. So if it's the best, healthiest looking plant, let that one be the one that goes to seed. Don't let the ones that are sort of really bug-eaten and not really delicious go to seed, because that will just encourage those plants to become more vibrant. Potatoes is also another really great one that you can do with no-dig. We're just getting a new bit of area started a couple of years ago, and the first thing we did was we just laid down a bit of compost, plugged a whole lot of bits of Kipfler potatoes, my kids' favourite potatoes, on top of the compost, and then just mulched on top. And then, when the tops of the potatoes died back, we just went back down and we dug up huge amounts of these beautiful Kipfler potatoes. It was Hugh's best day. He loves his potatoes. So, they're so easy. What I find too with no-dig potatoes is, as the top grows, just keep adding more mulch around it. You top dress it as they go, and then you'll get even more potatoes. It's a really easy way. And you can even do that in a tower, in a stack. If you've got a small spot, start with a few potatoes, add some compost on top and some mulch, and then just keep adding, maybe a bit more compost mulch as they grow. And then when it gets to the top and they all die back at the end of the season, growing season, just sort of knock it all over, and then you'll see all these potatoes in that, which is just a wonderful way to grow. So I've talked a little bit about perennials already, and this being an important part of a no-dig garden strategy. And I want to talk about the perennials from the perspective of them being leaving in what the roots do, and also the roots as a repository for the life in the soil. So by having lots of different perennials, so this one here is Brazilian spinach, but there's so many different perennials that you can have in your garden. You can see a number of them here. That's some of the ones that I've got in my garden. I'm sure you've got many others that you can have a look at. People like Martin Crawford with his no-dig garden, his food forestry books, you can see huge amounts of different sorts of plants in there. I should actually make a list of all these and share that with you. I will do that. So what I notice though is the roots of these, by not planting and pulling, these roots get deeper and deeper, and they help to create the structure of the soil. And as in the different seasons, as they sort of grow and contract, these perennials, they might shed some leaves, which becomes more organic matter. They're helping to keep the soil open. Actually having things alive in the soil all the time is keeping the soil alive as well. If you just plant and pull and have it fallow, what it means is there's not so much going on in the life, and the life sort of diminishes. So the more life you have continuously, the more life you'll have in the soil. And also what I find is the more diversity you have, the more that it feeds different aspects of the soil, and is always creating this protective layer as well, so it doesn't get exposed to the sun and get baked. And so, you can see in there green manures and there's sweet potatoes and mince and lots of different herbs. And then there's also dappled light from other things, which is particularly important here in the warmer climates to prevent the soil from getting too hot. And there's an enormous amount of abundance that comes with this, and the roots find their own space. And what I find is there's pulses in the different seasons, and I just allow it to find its own pulse. So certain things will come up and be really thriving at one time, and then they'll die back a bit, and they'll still be there. The roots will be in the soil, but maybe it's not their best season, and then something else will come up, and it will just keep pulsing like this, and an amazing amount of abundance. And like I said, wherever I see a gap, that's where I just plug the gap and keep it going. And having these different layers in there. So there's the root layer, there might be the herbaceous layer, then there's the mid-shrub layer, and there's some things up the top. So depending on where you are and how much sunlight you have, and the strength of your soil at this point will determine how many layers. So just work towards having as many layers as you possibly can, and play with that, experiment with that. See if you can tuck some things underneath things if you've got some light coming in. So if you've got a space, just see how much you can fill. And what I also really encourage too is that with this diversity too is trying to create more garden and less path. And so the idea of this is, often when we see garden design, you'll see like there's a garden bed and then lots of pathway, another garden bed, lots of pathway. So I flip this idea and try and make sure that as much as possible you have just these dense plantings, which means that there's lots of things going on above, lots of things going on below. You've got these mycelial networks which are connecting all this. So essentially what I try and create is just lots of big beds with little pathways into them, which means I access them and not compacting by walking on them, but that each of these beds is essentially connected to the other by what's going on underneath. And I think the unseen, what's going on underneath, is so important, and that we need to focus on creating the conditions that can thrive. Now, also within this kind of system too, once it gets more perennial and dense like this, you can let the animals into it. They won't be destroying it like you're letting them into a bed of lettuces, for example. So this is another reason, because it helps to keep the animals healthier and happier by giving them a chance to get out and about into this area. And they help doing a lot of the pest management as well. And it's not only chickens. I notice that there's all different animals, wild animals in my garden that are helping me with this. So creating that density in the home for all different sorts of ecological systems, like all different, an ecology for all different species, means that I have helpers of lizards and frogs and little birds, little insectivorous birds that come, all kinds. So it's just a wonderful space. And the thing that I also wanted to mention too about the roots is that when an area has been finished, so there was a little section here that had some annuals. There was some lettuces and bits and pieces in here. Now, because this is right next to where my kitchen is, so I come out for lunch and I grab bits and pieces, the rockets and the spinaches and the shallots and the parsleys and the flowers and the kales, and that's all goes into my lunch. But when it finishes, rather than just clearing the whole garden, I'll just maybe top dress over a space that's there. And then the roots of the other plants in and around, they get fed by this composite. But they also become the repository for the soil life and the organisms, so that they very quickly recolonize what's going on in this area. So there's been a disturbance here, but they will rapidly recolonize that area, rather than the whole area being emptied, dug over, and life has to start from scratch. So with this, what we're not trying to do is to take things back to square one every single time we make a garden. We're trying to amplify the life that's already there. And I think this is a big difference in this approach of rather than scraping things back, going back to scratch, starting right back at ground zero with the annuals, is to tend your garden towards the perennials, towards this living system that can almost be looking after itself. So leave the roots too. This is one of my important points of the 5 key tips, is that if you are pulling out those roots, you're losing the organic matter in the soil. You are taking away the food from the soil life that's there, and you end up, the soil structure starts to collapse a bit and gets more compacted. So again, you have to start. So what I try and do as much as possible is, if a season's finished or something, is just to leave the material there and top dress over the top of that with more compost or more mulch. And if there's some plants that are finished, is just to snip off and lay them down so the roots stay in the ground and break down, add into that beautiful, becomes the humus in the soil. And so the last key point that I wanted to make of my top tips was about top dressing. So I know I've mentioned this before, but I encourage you to do it regularly. Keep an eye on it. So, if there's a spot that needs redoing, add some compost over the top. So I like to do a top dressing of compost at least once a year, that I get a nice big covering over it. If there's already perennials there, I will just go in and around those. If it's a spot where there's just lots of plants, I'll actually just be adding compost every time I plant something new, and it's just this spot planting. So compost on top, compost when you're planting, scattering it around, and also keeping on adding mulch. So you get this constant flow of new material coming on top, as well as the materials that will be dying back. So you have the living mulch, so the sweet potatoes as they die back, or maybe the cannas as they drop back. The turmeric leaves and all different sorts of things will just keep adding in. The beans, the peas, add that into the soil, add the compost on top, add the mulch on, and just keep doing that. And if you notice a spot where there's a preponderance of weeds coming through, and I've got one in my garden at the moment that I've noticed, that's where I'm going to just come in. I'll put some more compost in. That's where I put some more newspaper and top dress. The other areas which don't have the weeds, I don't worry about it. It's just the compost and the mulch then. And so this is a constant thing that we do, and always just adding, and it's helping to protect the soil life. If you notice when you're doing the mulch, it will dissipate quite quickly over time. And if you can start to see the soil or see the newspaper, that the newspaper will either get broken down more rapidly, as I said, or if you can see the soil life will actually start to die because of the exposure. So sometimes if it feels like the soil is really compacted and it's not thriving, I might come back and just open a little bit gently with a fork, not turning it, but just gently prising it open. Not so much that I'm going to break all the soil life relationships in there and the hyphae threads, but just a bit to open up. So the key top tips that I have expressed in this masterclass are around primarily the idea of making topsoil. Making topsoil that is going to be drawing down carbon, making topsoil that's going to be absorbing moisture, making topsoil that's going to be feeding the soil life, which then helps to feed the plants and create healthy, strong, pest-resilient, hardy plants that will have more nutrient density for you. Also diversifying the types of foods that you choose to plant and choose to eat. And in doing that, favouring perennials because they have this deeper root system. They become repositories for the soil life and actually become far easier for you to be able to grow an abundance of food, not only for you and your household, but to be able to share as well. And make sure that the next season that you're actually leaving the roots. Don't sort of plant and pull them and take them away somewhere else. Leave them in the ground there. Chop off the tops if you need to and drop them down or put them into the compost. But leave the roots to break down and keep the soil structure and keep, feeding the soil life. And then just keep in mind too that to just constantly top dress. More compost, more mulch, more compost, more mulch. If you have a spot that needs some weed attention, you might put some more weed barrier there before the mulch. And that's it. That's kind of the key strategies that I use to maintain, to develop and to maintain no-dig gardens. And this is kind of where I've got to after experimenting for so many years with this. And really, too, I guess the key point is about the garden not just being an annual garden. This garden is a forage garden. It's a food forest. It's a mixture of annuals and herbs and vegetables and fruits and climbers and root crops and pond plants as well. So thanks for listening. I just want to let you know about a few of the things that are going on with the work that we do here at the Permaculture Educator. So we offer an online Permaculture Educators program, which is a combination of the Design Certificate and a Permaculture Teacher Certificate. This has students on 6 continents, and we have online material, but also regular design studios and education labs, film clubs, masterclasses like these, and pollination sessions. So if you're interested in finding out more about that, you can take a look over at the Permaculture Education Institute website, which is, I'm just about to release this new version of it, which will be a place where you can find out all the different things that we do, from our masterclass, our webinars, our courses, and all the resources from things like the podcast. So I also release a weekly podcast talking to people who are involved either directly or indirectly with the work of permaculture. So you can find that on Sense Making in a Changing World, which will be linked from my new website. You can also check out my blog, which is Our Permaculture Life, and here you'll find links also to the podcast, but also to all the different films that I make, articles that I write. So check out that at Our Permaculture Life, and I encourage you to subscribe if you're not already. So if you just go to this page up on the top there, you'll see in the menu subscribe, and then you'll get updates of whether there might be films, events, podcasts, any sort of new article that's coming up. And also the YouTube channel. So one of the main films that's on there is this How to Make a No-Dig Garden film. And then there's lots, like maybe 150 or more different films there now about different aspects of this type of gardening. So I encourage you to have a look at that. So if you just Google Our Permaculture Life on YouTube, that will come up. And I encourage you to subscribe there. So I'm trying to put a weekly video up on there, something new each time about a different aspect of gardening. So thank you so much for being here today. I encourage you to stick around and ask some more questions. I'm going to leave this up here for a moment because it has the different websites. So permacultureeducationinstitute.org is where you'll find information about the courses, but it's also going to be the portal where you can find out about all the different things that are happening. There's the blog where you'll find links to the YouTube, the podcast, and also a very practical online course called The Incredible Edible Garden. So that's our permaculturelife.com. I also run a permaculture education charity, which is offering free permaculture education to people mostly in refugee settlements. And this is linked too with the work of the Global Permaculture Youth, the Perma Youth, which is coordinated by my daughter and started by a number of young people who are part of the Permaculture Education Institute. So dive into all of those resources, and please, if you have any questions, get in touch. My email address is morag@permacultureeducationinstitute.org, and I'm always very happy to talk with people about anything to do with permaculture, and also particularly if you're interested in becoming a permaculture educator, because what I feel right now is that the world needs more permaculture educators. This is one of the key solutions that I keep hearing people talking about all the time, that we need to focus on how we're growing our food, what we're doing with our soil, diminishing the need for fossil fuels, or actually getting away from fossil fuels, which means relocalizing our food system, growing as much food as we can. And this no-dig method is one of the best ways that I know how to do that. So I hope this has been a helpful session for you, and I encourage you to get out and experiment and try your own. Have a look at all the different sorts of no-dig garden methods that you can, and play with it. See what works for you in your place, and then share that. Show other people in your neighbourhood. Make your own videos and share that too. All right. Take care, everyone. I'll be here for the next few minutes to answer your questions in this masterclass. And if you're watching this as a recording, don't forget you can put down your questions below and your comments and share ideas that you've got too about no-dig gardening. All right, everyone. Take care. Stay safe. Until next time. Bye.